Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here. I look forward to taking part in the rest of the sessions later on today. Can you hear me okay? I'm a low talker, so if I start to go down, just ramp me back up. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing at the Data Justice Lab. We launched the lab about a year ago. The lab is a space where we, as it says here, we research. Our aim is not just to research social justice implications of datafication, but also to advance social justice implications also to advance social justice aims in an age of datafication. The lab is co-directed by myself, Lena Densik, Aaron Hintz, and Emiliano Chire. We're working on a range of projects, and we're also growing. So we now have some postdocs, some PhDs. But I think it's important to note where we come from. So we're social scientists. We largely engage in qualitative research, although we're employing some more quantitative and data analysis research now. We're moving into that area. We come from previous work. So Lena and Arna have looked at predictive policing. They've been studying the implications of surveillance and how society has responded to some of the things we've been learning about surveillance practices and government surveillance. I've been looking at poverty politics. So a lot of what I've done in the past has looked at the way that representations of poverty influence what is or is not done about it. And Emiliano's been looking at what activists are doing in the global south. He's looking at the way they communicate, the way they protest, the way they engage with various issues. So just as a broad overview, these are some of the projects that we've started in the last year. I'm going to talk about two of them today, the first two. So I'm going to talk about the Data Harms Project, the project that involves looking at data harms and some of the adverse effects we're seeing as big data gets integrated, big data systems get integrated across sectors. I'm also going to talk about the Investigating Data Governance Project, which looks at the way that governments are using some of these new data systems and what the implications are, and what government agencies, departments, civil servants, what they're saying as they try to make use of these tools. The case study I'm going to talk about today refers to the Canadian context. But we've expanded that project. So we've moved it now into looking at the UK. And this is the Data Scores as Governance project that we're just kind of getting going at. I don't have much to say about it at this point, but we're pretty excited about it because we're expanding our methods. We're looking at how predictive analytics, algorithmic decision-making, automated systems are being employed across local governments in the United Kingdom and what some of the implications are. Lena Densik is heading up this data justice project. This is quite a large project that she's starting that's looking at how marginalized communities are being affected by some of these new data practices. We're looking at data policies and the new policies and regulatory frameworks influencing platforms. And then finally, Emiliano's looking at big data from the global south and lessons that we can learn from what's happening in some of these areas. We're pretty excited about this upcoming event. So we're hosting a data justice conference in May. This is quite a large conference. It's going to be the first international conference on data justice issues, bringing together a really diverse group of people. We're also building in and working on data literacy workshops. So the first of these we're starting to work on right now, and that involves providing critical data literacy skills, critical data literacy training for journalists who might want to investigate some of these practices. And this makes sense for us, of course, because we're in a school of journalism, media, and culture. Okay, so today I've arranged this talk so that I'm going to focus on the two projects, as I mentioned. The talk's going to focus in two parts. So in the first part today, I'm going to talk about the Data Harms Project. The idea behind this project is that it's pretty common to hear at this point that with big data comes great opportunity, but also great risk. And what I wanted to do was to take up this question of risk, because risk implies some sort of future, some sort of dangerous future that we might be entering into, right? And of course that's true, but I think it diverts attention, the notion of risk diverts attention to away from what is already happening. And what we know and what we're learning more and more about all the time is that people are being negatively affected by some of these new data systems. And the idea behind the data harm record is that we need to learn from and pay attention to where things are going wrong. And that by building kind of a cross-national, transnational body of work, we can learn more by looking at some of the similarities, some of the differences. So what did we do? So the methods that we've employed here, we've compiled examples. So this involved looking at previous publications, looking at documents. And what you'll often find is that when people talk about the way that data is being used, they'll often include an example, or an anecdote about where things have gone wrong. And I think that in some ways this is really useful, but it's also somewhat misleading because by providing only one or two anecdotes, you don't really get a sense of what the big picture is. So what we wanted to do was to pull together as many examples as we possibly could. And I should say that if you wanted to scroll forward here, sorry. If you want to take a look at the record, which I'm going to get to in a moment, you can look at this link on the top of the screen. Okay, so we also are conducting interviews. We just started this part of it. The interviews involves looking at the people who are challenging and contesting some of the adverse effects of data that they're finding in their communities. The interviews that we've been doing are being done with advocates, with legal aid lawyers, with activists, etc., across nations. So far we've been interviewing people in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the Netherlands. And the interview project is ongoing because the project is still ongoing. We've also been looking at the information reports that have been published by privacy commissioners. I'm going to go through a summary now, a quick overview summary, just to highlight the kind of harms that we're identifying and that are being recorded in the record. But after this, what I plan to do is highlight and pull out some of the examples, just to give you an idea and a taste of some of the stories, because I think stories, when we talk about adverse effects of data, are really, really important. So what we've seen and what the record documents are some of the harms that have been caused by commercial uses of data. So these relate to potentials for exploitation that have to do with the way that certain groups of people are being targeted because of what's known about them or the way that they're grouped into particular segments. And I'll talk about that more in a second. There are examples of unintentional and intentional discrimination. And of course, here the unintentional becomes all important because often these harms are occurring not because people intended them to, but because of the way that proxies serve for things that we have long protected, like for categories that have been protected that should not be used to make decisions about people, like ethnicity or like class or like religion. There are ongoing examples of loss of privacy and data breaches. These have been going on for a while. The record documents physical injury. So the more that these data systems are integrated into workplaces to monitor the way that people are working, we're seeing examples of employees feeling like they are under extreme pressure and trying to improve their performance in ways that can actually lead to physical injury. Of course, there are problems when there's no data about you in a data filed world too, right? So people are talking about examples where if you're poor, if you don't participate in this kind of new data world, then there are questions and points that need to be raised about to what extent you will be considered in some of the decision-making systems. The political context here is the one I would say that's in the news most lately. So the record documents examples of political manipulation and social harm. Some of this work has been done by the Oxford Internet Institute. And of course, we're hearing about this a lot lately in relation to fake news, in relation to bots, etc. I'm going to talk about the governance examples probably the most today. But the kinds of harms that we're seeing in our research have to do with data errors. So this is connected to poor quality data. It's connected to small data as it pulls into some of these larger big data systems. And also harms that are connected to automation errors, so automative systems. And then there's been work about problems with algorithm machine bias. Okay. So people are drawing attention to the kinds of discrimination and social sorting that is made possible through these new data systems. And the argument is that combining multiple forms of data sets, a lot can be learned. So Newman has called this algorithmic profiling, and he raises concerns about how much of this profiling is invisible as citizens are unaware of how data is collected about them across their searches, transactions, movements, communications, etc. This data can be used to profile and sort people into marketing categories. Some of these, of course, are highly problematic. And here I'm noting the work of Pam Dixon of World Privacy Forum. This is her presentation to a Senate committee investigating data broker practices, where she highlights some of the research that they've been doing. And one of the things that they found, just as an example, was data brokers selling lists of rape victims, addresses of domestic violence shelters, sufferers of genetic diseases, sufferers of addiction, and more. Other people doing research in this area are raising concerns about discriminatory potentials. So, for example, how discrimination can enter a system in processes of credit scoring, in processes of providing or not providing insurance, in hiring decisions. So this comes into play the more that companies are using automated systems to sort through and sift through the massive amount of CVs that they're getting. And there are also concerns about how some of these biases can enter in the kinds of education opportunities that are or not offered to people. So ProPublica, who's done a lot of work in this area, has got this story where they did a lot of research into car insurance rates. And what they found in their 2017 investigation, they partnered up with Consumer Reports. And what they found is that minority neighborhoods pay more for car insurance than white neighborhoods with the same risk levels. The study, which compared premiums and payouts in California, Illinois, Texas, and Missouri, showed that minority neighborhoods paid as much as 30% more than other areas with similar accident costs. Now, I think that this is particularly important, and it rings true for me as a North American, because I understand how important your car can be in some of these communities in order to get to work. So if you can't afford your car insurance, in some cases, you can't get to work. This is a really serious problem. I was happy to hear that Joy Buolamwini was mentioned in the introduction today, and I've flagged her up here because of some of the work that she's been doing around facial recognition programs. And one of the problems, as is already mentioned, with some of these facial recognition systems is that there's a difference in how they can and cannot identify people. And some of these systems are having problems identifying people who are not white, which of course is connected to the training data that are used to develop them. One of the things that Joy Buolamwini is arguing is that the issue of bias and inaccuracy becomes increasingly important as these facial recognition tools are adopted by police and security systems. So we've seen the case, and one of the cases that she talks about is a case in New Zealand where one man's passport photo was rejected when a facial recognition program mistakenly identified him as having closed eyes because of the shapes of his eyes. ProPublica has also done another really important story. This one has gotten a lot of attention. This is a story about the use of predictive risk assessments in the United States. And what they did was respond to concerns that were being raised in communities by people who were saying, wait a second, black and white people, they're not being treated equally by these systems. And this is really important because the risk scores that are being attached to defendants are being used to determine sentencing, being used to set bonds, etc. So what ProPublica did, because they didn't have access to the model, they didn't have access to the algorithm that was being used, it was proprietary, they launched the study of the risk scores, and they looked at the risk scores that were assigned to 7,000 people, and they checked to see how many of these people were charged with new crimes. They found that the risk scores were remarkably unreliable in forecasting violent crime. But the big issue and the big problem they identified was bias. The formula that was much more likely to flag black defendants as future criminals than white defendants. White people were also wrongly labeled as low risk more often than black defendants. So you can see the example that they show here, and if you go to their website and you look at the story, there's a number of other examples that illustrate this point. But you can see Brescia Borden, who had, prior to her risk score being calculated, 4 juvenile misdemeanors. She didn't go on to produce any other subsequent offenses, but she was categorized given a high risk score of reoffense as an 8. This is after she essentially took a joyride on a bike. Her and her friend, they took a joyride on a bike and a scooter. On the left-hand side here, you can see Vernon Prater. He had, prior to the risk score being assessed to him, 2 armed robberies, 1 attempted armed robbery. And he went on to commit another offense. He was given a lower risk score than her. And there are numerous examples of this. Now, I'll say that the issue isn't just that these risk scores the system is biased. The issue is also in how this system is used. So the people who developed this risk assessment tool, when they were interviewed, they said, look, we never intended for this risk score to be used to set someone's sentence or be used to set bonds. It was only meant to be one information source in a pool of many. But the problem is function creep, of course, because these tools and systems, as they get used by people in the government sector, are operating in contexts where public servants, those working in areas of justice, are under increasing pressure because they don't have the resources, they don't have the time to do the kind of work they would do normally. And so you have to be considering and thinking about always how these scores, how these systems might be used in ways not initially intended. The point I want to underline here, and this is a point that's being raised by Virginia Eubanks, by Kathy O'Neill, by us at the Data Justice Lab, is that these systems, they impact all of us, but they don't impact us all equally. And that's increasingly important in a datafied world. Okay, I want to zoom in a little bit, and I want to focus on this Australian case study. Many of you likely may have already heard about it. This Australian case study involves an attempt by government to identify overpayment of benefits to people. And what they employed was a data matching system that would identify where people had been overpaid their benefits over years. And what they did then is send out letters to people saying, we have identified this debt. You must prove now that this identification is wrong, or you must pay back the debt. And then they employed debt collection companies to kind of go out and get people to repay their debts. The Ombudsman and the Senate launched an investigation into the government's automated debt recovery system after numerous complaints were lodged about errors. So a lot of people started reporting that there were major problems with the way that the system was working. And that there were also concerns raised about the unfair targeting of vulnerable people. So people, as you can imagine, who may have received benefits, you've got a disproportionate number of people who are struggling for various reasons, whether they be physical, whether they be health-related. You also have people who have, as we know with social services, people go in and out of the system. So what happened in this context is that you also had people who may have relied on the system for a time while they were a student, but who have gone on to quite high-paying jobs, to quite respected positions in society. You know, you had a mix of people getting these letters, which is why the response people in Australia are arguing was so powerful, why the activists were able to challenge what was happening so effectively and garner the kind of media attention that they did. I'll tell you one example. So one case involved a man who was repeatedly sent letters saying he owed the government repayment of $4,000, which is an incredible amount of money if you don't have any money, and if you're being threatened about what happens if you don't repay. This turned out to be an error. The man, who suffers from depression and became suicidal, said he successfully convinced the government this was an error, only to receive a similar letter a few months later. He again successfully proved this was an error. One of the Ombudsman's conclusions when the Ombudsman looked into the system was that better project planning and risk management should have been done from the outset. The big issue that's emerged from this case is the amount of time that is required for people to challenge the errors, the amount of effort, the amount of resources that are required in order to do this successfully, and the lack of information they have and how difficult it is to get information about what is being used to target and identify them. In this situation, there was a fairly quick and massive mobilization, as I mentioned, by a diverse group of people. This case is similar to some of the other cases that we're seeing in that one of the first groups of people to become aware that something was not right, that things were going wrong, were people working in legal aid. And people working in legal aid started to be approached by people in their community who were looking for help, who felt powerless in how to challenge what they knew was wrong. But as you can imagine, if you're talking about someone challenging you about 7 years prior, 7 years of your financial history, things get a little bit cloudy, especially if you're living in a precarious situation. So people genuinely were confused and didn't really know how to navigate this system. The diverse group of network that came together included people who had experienced these harms. So these included single moms. These included data scientists, which became really important. These included lawyers. These included people in areas of other public administration. So there was a diverse group of people who came together, and they made great use of social media. So they created this website, Not My Debt. The site itself became a resource. People were encouraged to post stories of what was happening to them anonymously. The website also became a site through which people could gain information about what was going on to themselves and others, and could access help. They also mobilized on Twitter, and here's an example of the kind of story that you can find on the Not My Debt website. So in this case, the person had their debt issued in December 2017, and they note feeling sick about this. They talk about the difficulty they have trying to get information about what information is being used to say that they owe this amount of money, and they're now resorting to filing freedom of information requests in order to get information about their case. The group and the organization garnered a lot of media attention because of their ability to organize effectively, but also because of their ability to manage the media. So one of the things that the activists did successfully was created a pool of people who could respond to media queries quickly. They made the issue political. They're targeting politicians now in areas where people have been affected largely by some of these robo-debts. I think this case demonstrates something that is flagged up in a lot of the other cases, and that is the shift in responsibility, the change in state-citizen relations that we're seeing as these practices get introduced. And this becomes really important because in this case, what you're seeing is that it's the responsibility of the citizen to prove that the information that is being used against them, that there's an error, right? But they're being asked to prove that there's an error without, in some cases, understanding the system that's being used against them, or without access to the information that is being used to make decisions about them. For those trying to change this system, much like those trying to change some of these adverse effects in other countries and in other areas, you're dealing with a range of challenges. So activists get tired. They're doing this a lot on their own time. It can be difficult to get people to respond. The initial response is often denial. It takes a long time. So this has been going on now for over a year, and this system is still ongoing despite various reviews. And trying to challenge these problems through the legal system as the legal system operates now is very, very difficult, and I'm going to come back to that in the end of this discussion. So just in summary of this first part of the presentation, I wanted to flag some of the social justice concerns that I think are really important that we're seeing come out of these cases in this data harm study. So inequality, of course. Marginalized communities are more negatively affected than other groups. There are issues of fairness that we really have to take into consideration. We're dealing with changing power dynamics. Citizens often do not understand, do not have the resources, do not have the access to the kind of information they would need in order to engage democratically with the systems that are affecting them. We're also seeing issues of rights. So the law is not adequately protecting people or providing adequate access to justice. Okay, now I'm going to shift to part two. And in the second part of the study, I want to talk about another research project that shifts the focus from those who are being negatively affected and some of the work that activists and advocates are doing to challenge adverse effects of data systems. I want to switch now to government, and I want to look at what public servants, civil servants are saying as they try to make use of these new data systems. So this project, as I mentioned, is part of a larger project that's looking at investigating the datafication of governance. We know that governments are investing heavily in order to make greater uses of big data systems across areas. To date, I've been looking at the Government of Canada. We started looking at the United Kingdom and local government in the United Kingdom. I've been looking at changes taking place in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. The goal, the aim, with the Canadian case study and with this latest study on the United Kingdom is first to map where and how, what we're referring to as big data systems, where predictive risk analytics, where algorithmic decision making, where automated systems are being used, where these are being integrated, just to get a picture, an overview that others can rely upon. The hope, the aim, is to research the situated contexts where these systems are being used, because as you know, contexts are all important in these cases, and how these systems are applied in one department are going to vary greatly from how they're applied in another department. The goal and the aim, which is not always achievable, is to try to get a sense of what Kitchen and Loriot call a data assemblage. So some of the things that we think about as really important here are in relation to the contextual factors about how these systems are used, have to do with the institutional environments, the actors themselves, what kind of agency they have, the political climates that surround the way these systems are being used. This is really important because, you know, these systems could be used to identify people who are in need and to provide those people with better services earlier, what we might call a carrot approach, to surround people with the kind of help they need earlier so that crisis doesn't happen down the road. And in this way, if applied in this way, in this kind of political context, then the system would actually reduce inequality, of course, right? But the systems can also be employed in ways that are punishing. So one of the things Virginia Eubanks talks about in her research in the United States is that where some of these systems are being employed, they're part of long-standing historical practice where there has been an effort to punish the poor, to separate and categorize into deserving and undeserving categories, and then implement policy and services in that way. Other contextual factors that matter are legislative frameworks, infrastructure, finance and marketing, advocacy networks, and the working practices, the working practices in the places where these things are being introduced. I wanted to talk to civil servants about what they think about the implications of these new systems. And the aim has been to hear from and learn from what they think the implications are in terms of the benefits, but also the risks and the harms. The methods here are diverse, and it involves a series of problem-solving steps. So in the UK study, we're expanding the kind of methods that we're using, and we're using some more computational strategies. With this first Canadian study, it involved a lot of desk-based research, so cross-national comparison, looking to see what was happening, trying to identify as much as possible what was published about what was happening. Because one of the problems, and one of the major problems I'm going to argue, is that we don't know where and how these systems are being introduced. So it's quite a lot of work just to put the information together. It involved interviews, so interviewing public servants, consultants, those working in civil society in the nonprofit sector. It's involved freedom of information requests. So at the moment, there have been 18 departments and 18 freedom of information requests were filed to various departments and agencies. This is not ideal. Freedom of information requests took a very long time. There have been major appeals. There's a huge delay in responding. So at the moment, I've received, I think, 12 responses. I'm still waiting on about 6. This is 2 years later. What this has involved is document analysis, so reading through the massive amount of information that we've gotten back, so over 1,400 pages of documents. I don't have time today to go into all the findings. I'm happy to talk about them later. Some of them are published. The initial findings were published in a book called Compromised Data, From Social Media to Big Data, that I co-edited with a couple of other people. Other results from the findings hopefully are going to be published in the next year. But generally, what I did was I produced a map, an initial map based on the information that I could get. I also identified through what I call listening in to the way that public servants are talking about these systems, to the benefits and promises that they're identifying and that they're seeing. And I don't have too much time to talk about that right now, because I'm focusing on these kind of larger social justice implications. But in general, some of the kinds of benefits that people are identifying are the ability to access and accelerate research, to customize and improve program and service delivery and development. These are seen as kind of the major benefits, the ability to improve the kind of systems that are already in place, but also to advance knowledge, particularly in areas of health, genomic research, et cetera. Some of the concerns that are being raised relate to privacy and security. And of course, this is pretty common when these systems are talked about already. The concerns that people often raise connect to privacy and security. The issue is that public servants are raising is that anonymization, although it's promised, in practice is a real challenge. There are concerns about linking databases and how this might enable deeply personal portraits about people that becomes really important because of the way that these portraits might be used in ways that weren't originally or intended, or because of the way that these new linked up data sets might be used in the way that the data wasn't initially intended. Consent becomes really important because consent, meaningful consent that people might give about how their data is used in one context is really difficult to obtain in these new systems because of the way that the systems might incorporate data and use data down the road, right? How do you obtain meaningful consent when you don't entirely know the kinds of data that you're going to be combining, that you're going to be trying to make sense of as you go forward? Public servants are raising concerns about the kind of data science skills they have in-house and the lack of data science skills they have in-house. Of course, there's vast differences between those departments who have a lot of history with working with data, those departments we might call data rich, and other departments who are new at this and who are trying to make more use of new big data systems. There's also concern raised about a lack of resources. Public servants are raising concerns about inaccuracy. They're raising concerns about the data quality. As we know, with government data sets across nations, data quality is a real issue. And so public servants are raising concerns about how data quality might influence the kind of results that they get, but they're also raising concerns about what they're seeing in the kind of results that they get as they try to make use of these systems. What's important, I think, going forward, especially as we think about the way that governments make use of these data systems, is how the concerns that are being raised externally, but really importantly, internally, the concerns that are raised in-house, how those concerns are being dismissed. And I think this is important because of what I saw going through the documents, in interviewing people. What you see is there's this compulsion to keep up, of course. And this is something that is creating a lot of pressure. But the compulsion to keep up should not be used as a means to dismiss the kind of concerns, the legitimate concerns that are being raised about the way these systems are used. And so one of the things that comes up is that often in a particular context, someone will raise an issue of data quality, or someone will raise an issue of privacy or security in connection to some of these data systems, and those concerns will be briefly noted, but the overarching message, as you can see in this memorandum to the Deputy Minister of Justice in Canada, the overarching message is, yes, we know there are concerns, we know there are risks, but we are in real danger if we don't keep up. The one overarching conclusion that can be derived from this work, and the work they're referring to is the research that the Department of Justice undertook to determine what they could do in order to make greater use of big data systems. The one conclusion that can be derived from this work is that large legal organizations that fail to plan for the implementation of new technologies are likely to find themselves at a significant disadvantage from a competitive and cost-effectiveness standpoint. Another concern I wanted to flag up, and this will be the last one that I talk about in relation to this topic today. There's others, but the other big one is this mode of dismissal, which what I argue connects to organizational culture. This idea that there's a culture of resistance, I think, has become almost common parlance across discourses, whether it comes from government, tech community, civil society. And I think this mode of dismissal is important to pay attention to because of how it might preempt or silence those who might want to raise legitimate concerns on the inside, but who might not feel like they have the kind of knowledge that will be taken seriously. So there's little doubt that big data, the uses of big data challenge traditional hierarchies of knowledge and power, and that new information sources and practices can be disruptive. But dismissing the concerns and resistance raised by civil servants about greater data sharing and challenges they see in using these applications makes it harder to learn from the critiques that they are raising. Of concern is how this cultural clash and narrative may be used to preemptively silence those within public service who might raise legitimate challenges to changing practices, or preemptively influence those in management positions to misidentify those who are raising such critiques as cultural resistors. Across this survey, this case study, by looking at what's happening in this Canadian context, the silence has also become really important. So as I mentioned, a lot of discussion about concerns in relation to privacy and security, not a lot about discrimination and fairness. Where discrimination and fairness is raised, it's coming out of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner's documents. There's not a lot of discussion about changing information systems and the implications of changing information systems. So how the kind of information that you generate about people influences the kind of decisions that are made about them, and what this kind of information does in terms of potentially sidelining other modes of information generation. And finally, I would argue that there's very little discussion about how the relationships with private companies, as in these contexts where you have government often forming partnerships with private companies in order to make use of some of these systems because they don't have the in-house skills, how we might need to rethink the nature of these public-private partnerships because of the way that proprietary information prevents citizens from gaining access about how these systems actually work, and therefore making these systems more democratic. So I want to conclude by bringing this all together. And I want to put together some concluding thoughts in brief summary. I would argue that ensuring fairness, equality, civic and human rights is key to this historic moment as we're seeing the datafication, particularly of public services, as data systems are increasingly being used to inform decision-making, but also mediate access to services. The kinds of things that I've been talking about today, I think, raise really important and legitimate questions about the kind of systems of transparency that we want, the kind of systems of accountability that we want, and the kind of oversight that we need, and also how we achieve meaningful citizen intervention in these new areas. A lot of people are talking about transparency. And of course, transparency is important, but transparency is not enough. It's not enough just to know that something is happening. How do you make these systems more accountable? At minimum, I would argue there needs to be audits pre and post implementation. The post here becomes really important. I would also agree with Cathy O'Neill, who's suggesting, and I'm quoting her here, that we need to audit across the stages of big data projects. This involves auditing the integrity of the data, the terms being used and what is considered as definitions of success, the accuracy of models with particular attention to who it fails, the long-term effects of the algorithms being used, and finally, the feedback loops being created through new big data applications, as, for example, we're seeing in the uses of predictive policing. Doing so also means introducing a way to ensure fair treatment, due process, and meaningful intervention by citizens. This will involve, I think, a shift in mindset in that I think there has to be, at least on the part of government, active encouragement of collaboration that is necessarily contesting some of these practices. So the active encouragement of dissent is a way to create more nuanced approaches of the complexity that people are facing in the projects they're undertaking. As some starting points, I would suggest data system maps detailing where and how, particularly when it comes to government, where and how these systems are being introduced, but also maps that indicate how citizen data is being shared. Data literacy becomes increasingly important, and I would argue it's now a government responsibility to ensure greater data literacy. And I don't think this is a radical proposition when you consider, for example, the data literacy programs that governments are already undertaking to educate their own public service. What we might do is ramp these up, expand them, employ civil society organizations to create broader civil society data literacy programs. There needs to be greater auditing across data projects, and this information made more public. We need more transnational comparison. We need greater collaboration between civil society individuals, groups, and government bodies. We also need to bring together those working in tech justice and social justice movements. And in some cases, I think it's really important that those working in areas of social justice, those who have been trying to advocate for fairness across public services, who have a long history of recognizing and identifying the discriminatory practices already existing, would have the kind of knowledge that is necessary to understand in a more detailed way how the kind of discrimination that we're seeing already gets written into some of these data systems. So we need to encourage greater collaboration, particularly with these groups who have long-standing history of challenging discrimination and inequality. And finally, in some cases, we may need to decide that there are some areas that we just don't go. So this is something that AI Now in the United States, Virginia Eubanks, have been talking about. They've been looking at examples in the United States where automated systems have been employed in ways that actually lead to real physical and mental harm because they cut off people's access to services and systems that they need, and then put responsibility on those people to then correct those inaccuracies or correct the problem. And the difficulty is that when you're talking about vulnerable populations, when you're talking about people who are already engaged in very precarious living situations, do you want to take that risk? Should you take that risk? Should you not just get it right in the first place? And that's where I'll conclude, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks very much.